I think that Xi Jinping has lost control of the Chinese military, and I think that he has lost some influence among civilian CCP leaders. We have seen a number of unexplained disappearances.
As rumors grow that Xi Jinping is losing power, I'm sitting down with China analyst Gordon Chang to get his read on what's going on.
Producer prices in July were down for the 34th straight month, and that shows you the state of the Chinese economy.
In this episode, we dive into infighting in Beijing, U.S.-China tariff talks, and the recent stunning destruction of a Chinese Coast Guard vessel by a Chinese Navy warship.
You can't have an accommodation with a regime that believes it must destroy you. And China's regime believes it must destroy us.
This is American Thought Leaders, and I'm Yanya Kellick. Gordon Chang, such a pleasure to have you back on American Thought Leaders.
Thank you so much, Jan.
We're going to talk about communist China, of course. We're going to talk about, the realities of the economy, some big changes, kind of leadership struggles and things like this within the CCP. But before we go there, this bizarre event where a Chinese Navy ship basically destroyed a Chinese Coast Guard ship, and the U.S. is sending ships into the region. What's going on there?
Yeah, on Monday, a Chinese Navy destroyer actually cut the bow off a Chinese Coast Guard cutter. Both of those Chinese vessels were chasing a Philippine Coast Guard cutter near Scarborough Shoal in the South China Sea. Scarborough is really important. It's very close to the main Philippine island of Luzon. It guards the mouths to both Manila and Subic Bays. Very strategic. The Chinese want it, and they are trying to chase the Filipinos out. Due to some really very clever seamanship on the part of the Philippines, they maneuvered the Chinese ships so that they collided. And right now, China is out for blood. They've been humiliated. One thing about this incident is important, and it's not getting that much attention. And that is that 4 Chinese Coast Guardmen were thrown into the sea after that collision. The Chinese destroyer did not render assistance. The Philippine Coast Guard cutter actually came back to look for the Chinese sailors, but nobody was found in the water. This shows you the nature of the Chinese regime, that they're leaving their own people in the water. And the Filipinos, who have every reason to be aggrieved, were the ones to render assistance. That just shows you what we're up against with regard to Beijing.
But it's just bizarre, though. Those seamen are presumably valuable, right, to the crew and so forth. It just doesn't make a lot of sense.
Well, human life doesn't mean very much to the regime. And we know that because the flag of the People's Republic of China is red. It's red for blood. They are willing to spill blood. And as people have pointed out, the person who was killed the most Chinese in history is Mao Zedong, the Mao who is still revered by the Communist Party. That tells us almost everything that we need to know about the People's Republic of China and the Communist Party.
So there's been this new development, of course. There's a U.S. destroyer that was sent into the region. Perhaps, there might even be more going in as we speak. And just frame for me very briefly, what has actually happened in that region, how these islands have been changed by the Chinese regime.
We need a little history here because this is Scarborough. In the first part of 2012, both Chinese and Philippine craft were crowding around that feature. The Obama administration brokered an agreement for both sides to withdraw their craft. Only the Philippines complied. And that left China in control of Scarborough since then. Now, the Chinese have not reclaimed Scarborough. In other words, they have not tried to turn it into a permanent outpost like they did in the South China Sea in the Spratly chain. But we got to remember what the Obama administration tried to do in 2012 was to make this go away. And the problem was that emboldened the worst aspects in the Chinese political system by showing everybody else that aggression worked. And so right after the incident at Scarborough, the Chinese ramped up pressure at another Philippine feature, Second Thomas Shoal, also in the South China Sea. They then started the reclamation of those features in the Spratly, and they ramped up pressure in Japan at the Senkakus in the East China Sea, which the Chinese claim is the Diaoyus. So the Chinese are pretty aggressive. They're pretty bold. They think they're in control of the situation. And the United States, and this is to the great credit of the Trump administration, has stationed 2 U.S. Navy vessels, the Higgins, which is an Arleigh Burke destroyer, and the Cincinnati, which is a littoral combat ship. They are now about 30 nautical miles away from Scarborough. Just about 24, 36 hours ago, the Higgins did a pass by Scarborough within 12 nautical miles of that feature. That is important from a technical point of view. The Chinese were enraged. This is, even though the Trump administration so far has acted perfectly in terms of trying to establish deterrence, this could really go very badly. We could see region-wide war sparked by what the Chinese plan to do at Scarborough, because although the Trump administration has handled this correctly, we're not driving events. The Chinese are, and that means they get to decide whether the world goes to war at Scarborough.
So let's talk about Xi Jinping and his approach. Of course, he's sort of taken this more Maoist approach to governance in communist China. But at the same time, his leadership is fraught increasingly. And this is something we've been following at Epoch Times quite a bit. But I would love to hear what you think about it. I mean, just recently, there's examples of people being removed on the one hand, in the military, then in the Central Commission as well. There's, someone that seems to be, basically out of favor all of a sudden on the Xi Jinping side. How does that all look? Like, how does this internal turmoil play out right now within the Chinese Communist Party, and what does it mean for us?
I think that Xi Jinping has lost control of the Chinese military, and I think that he has lost some influence among civilian CCP leaders. Start with the military. His number one guy in the military, his number one loyalist, his hatchet man, General He Weidong, has not been seen in public since March 11th, after the 2 sessions. And the New York Times article 3-4 days ago, and just about everybody says, well, Xi Jinping has been sacking his own loyalists. And that's possible, but I don't think that it is right. And the reason is that from July 9th of last year, there have been a series of articles in PLA Daily, the main propaganda organ of the Chinese military, that have praised collective leadership, quote unquote. That's a direct challenge to Xi Jinping's one-man rule style. And so these articles were written by people who are aligned with General Zhou Yangsha, who is the number one uniformed officer in the military, who is known to not be on particularly good terms with Xi Jinping. Now, General Zhang is, he's the number one vice chairman of the Communist Party's Central Military Commission. And I believe that he was responsible for getting rid of General He Weidong and some other Xi Jinping loyalists recently. This indicates the balance of information that we have. And by the way, we're guessing here, of course. But the balance of information is that Xi Jinping no longer controls the Chinese military because General Zhang does. On the civilian side of things, it's less clear. For basically 5 weeks, Xi Jinping just dropped out of propaganda. He dropped out of sight for the most part. Those times he did appear in media, he appeared in roles which showed that he had been diminished in stature. Beginning about, let's say, the second week in June, he has had a more prominent role in media. We also saw the disappearance of a senior Chinese diplomat, Liu Jiaochao, and we don't know what's going on there. This follows, of course, the disappearances of other civilian leaders. Again, this is really murky. Not all of it points to Xi Jinping losing influence, but some of it does. We will know a lot more after the 4th plenum in October, because I think we will see a number of things occur. So it's sort of like stay tuned, but I think that there is intense infighting in this regime, and that has all sorts of consequences for our dealing with China and how we can work with Beijing. In other words, I think we can't, because the regime is not in a position to deal constructively with anybody at this point.
Gordon, we're going to take a quick break right now, and folks, we're going to be right back. And we're back with Gordon Chang, Newsweek columnist and author of Plan Red, China's Project to Destroy America. Going back to this incident at Scarborough Shoal near the Philippines, does this impact how that situation will be viewed? Because, of course, as you mentioned, this is extremely embarrassing to the Chinese regime, their own Navy ship basically destroying one of their Coast Guard cutters. And you know, they're going to be looking for someone to blame, presumably, as they do, because the Communist Party can never be wrong or in error.
Yeah. If you give me a little time for background here, I have not been worried about the Chinese starting hostilities by launching an invasion of the main island of Taiwan. And that is for a number of internal Communist Party reasons. I just don't think it's in the cards. But that's not to say that Taiwan is safe or that the region is safe, because we have seen belligerent Chinese activity on a continual basis from South Korea to Japan to Taiwan to Philippines to faraway Australia. And I've always worried that one of those incidents can spiral out of control. And if they do, the regime cannot de-escalate because of what we've just been talking about, the political problems. There's something else that could cause problems, and that is somebody in the regime, could be Xi Jinping, could be General Zhang Yaoshao, could very well decide that it's in his interest to let an event spiral out of control or to pour fuel on the fire. And it's not because they want to start a war, but because I think that a political figure could decide that a conflict would be in his political interest. Because, for instance, with Xi Jinping, it could prevent others from moving against him, from challenging or deposing him if there is a conflict with, for instance, the Philippines or the United States. And that's why I'm really concerned about what's happening at Scarborough right now, because the Chinese, in general, even if things were calm in Beijing, would be looking for blood, somebody else's blood. And now things are much worse because of the political turmoil. So I think that this is an this is a very dangerous time right now.
Well, so given this reality, and I think, you know, there's a number of people in this current administration who understand these various elements, and also just in general in America, there's been a shift where people kind of understand the realities of the Chinese Communist Party and its ambitions at a greater level, at least than in the past. How is it that we are funding, you know, our investment banks, giant investment banks are funding IPOs like cattle? And of course, I'm not talking about cows here. I'm talking about this giant, well, now, you know, apparently extremely successful battery manufacturer where the batteries are used in Chinese military submarines. I mean, this is a military company. Why are we funding these things?
This is where I get really angry. It is strategically wrong for us to deal with these Chinese companies for the reasons you suggest, but it's morally wrong. It's morally wrong to help an enemy. China has declared the United States to be its enemy. They did that in May 2019, for instance, when People's Daily ran a landmark editorial that declared a quote-unquote people's war on us. The PLA Daily in March of 2023 defined people's war. We didn't need a definition of people's war. We know what that phrase means. It goes back to the Maoist era, carries great resonance in Communist Party thought. But in case anybody needed clarification, in March 2023, PLA Daily defined people's war as total war. So we know what's going on here, and yet we maintain relations with Beijing.
And Gordon, if I may jump in, and I think total war means, you know, this unrestricted war, basically using all means to wage warfare to diminish the enemy in all sorts of ways.
Yes, absolutely. You're absolutely right about that. Unrestricted Warfare is that title of that slim 1999 book by two Chinese Air Force colonels that argued that China could use any tactic to take down the U.S. And 2 years before 9/11, they even wrote about bin Laden attacking the United States. Bin Laden, who China had a relationship with in 1999. So let's understand what the stakes are here. So we should have no business, no commercial, no investment ties with China. This is wrong. And future generations are going to look back at us and say, who were these Americans?
This is one of the basically very difficult realities we have in, frankly, every Western liberal democracy that works with China, that has been doing engagement with China. In Canada, this is maybe even a level up from here in the U.S. But there's been this deep engagement, and there's a lot of people that have been touched by it, and in some in very, very serious ways, compromised ways, and this is just something we have to deal with as a society in general. You have thoughts on how to approach that, because a lot of people entered with presumably good intentions, and just kind of ended up in this situation, or do you view it differently?
Well, we're a democracy, and democracies are very bad at defending themselves until a lot of people get killed. So let's go back and look at Al-Qaeda, which I think sets the pattern. I mean, actually, if you want to look at the pattern, you go back to Tocqueville in the 1800s. But let's look at something recent, something that Americans still may remember. And that is, in 1993, Al-Qaeda killed 6 Americans with the bombing of the North Tower of the World Trade Center. And we couldn't care less. And so we couldn't care less until one day when Osama bin Laden reached out and killed 2,977 Americans. This is a time when we Americans are going to decide whether we are just going to surrender to China or whether we're going to fight for our society, because we're going to have to fight for it if we want to keep it.
Well, and one way this is manifesting, actually, come to think of it, is, the State Department recently released its, human rights report, which China features very prominently in, and especially in this realm of transnational repression, basically the Chinese Communist Party targeting Americans and targeting people on American soil. And of course, this is a pattern that happens elsewhere. So, I guess I'm just trying to add a little bit of color. Maybe you can speak to that a little bit. That this isn't something that's isolated. Even there's basically direct action on people here.
In our country right now, there are networks of Chinese agents, operatives, and soldiers. With the increase in the flood of Chinese migrants during the Biden years, we saw a change in the composition of those Chinese migrants. So if you go to the beginning of the flood, we were seeing primarily family groups come across. In other words, people who were desperate to live in a free society. Towards the last year of the Biden administration, the composition had changed. At least 2/3, and in some border crossings, 85% of the Chinese migrants were single males, of military age, traveling without family members, often pretending not to speak English. Border Patrol knew that some of them had links to the Chinese military. And by the way, towards the end of the Biden years, we saw these packs of males come across with identical kit. This occurred while there was an increase in tempo of Chinese nationals trying to gain entry into our military bases, either by sneaking in, barging in, or by attempting to enter through under false pretenses. There's been illicit surveillance of our bases and our infrastructure by the Chinese. They're preparing for attack. They're looking at our patterns. They're studying our vulnerabilities. And the only reason why we have not been attacked on our own soil is because Xi Jinping, or whoever is in charge in China right now, has thought it not to be in China's interest to give the go signal. But once they give the go signal, we will be fighting a foreign enemy on our soil for the first time since the War of 1812.
Gordon, when we last interviewed, it was just the beginning of these U.S. trade policies that looked, I think we discussed this, that looked to us like they were specifically looking at countering the Chinese Communist Party. Of course, other countries as well, but with a particular interest. We talked about transshipment and trying to stop that phenomenon. Now we're many months into this policy. We're kind of in, I think the CCP has just been given kind of an extension on kind of coming up with a deal before, those tariffs numbers will increase. Where do you think things stand right now? And by the way, I just might mention, this is at the same time when, Apple, for example, is promising to invest massively in U.S. manufacturing and start building iPhones here. That's interesting. So anyway, there's all these dimensions. How do you see that element?
Well, the Trump administration this month has given China a second 90-day extension on those elevated tariffs. Normally, delay helps China because it gives them more time to steal our intellectual property and to engage in predatory trade practices. This 90-day extension covers both the Halloween and Christmas shipments. So, normally this would help China. This time might be a little bit different, Jan, and the reason, two reasons. First of all, our tariffs are, general tariff rate is 30%, their general tariff rate is 10%, so that's somewhat advantageous. And the 20% difference is because of fentanyl, the fentanyl tariff. The other thing and more important reason why this delay might actually help us is because President Trump is signing up these framework trade deals with other countries. And these deals tend to redirect trade away from China. So for instance, the UK deal in May actually has provisions which say that the reduced tariff rates for British goods coming into the US apply only if they don't have components from countries of concern, which is China. So that redirects British trade and away from China. But also, we're seeing the EU deal, which was incredibly important, a big defeat for China. And, then there's Japan, South Korea, Indonesia. So these things are moving in the right direction. But the problem here, though, and it's a propaganda one, but propaganda is important. China is making the case that it holds the whip hand over the United States, that they're winning the trade war. And from an objective point of view, one could argue that they're right, but that view is now predominant not only in the United States, but around the world. So Trump is in the short end of this. And what is really concerned is that Trump holds the high cards, most of the high cards here. And he's still playing a very strong hand in a very weak manner. He is allowing the Chinese, at least at this point, to look like they're winning. So I think Trump needs to go and bring the hammer down on China and show who's boss.
Gordon, this has been an absolutely fascinating conversation. A final thought as we finish?
We're at a point where we are going to have to fight to defend our country. The Communist Party is falling apart. We don't know how far the disintegration process will go, but we need to have robust measures to protect the United States, our friends, and our partners. This is one of the most consequential moments in history, and we had better get this right, because if we don't get this right, I fear that the future of humanity is going to be a lot darker than we envision now.
Well, Gordon Chang, it's such a pleasure to have had you on.
It is such a pleasure to be here, Jan, and I very much appreciate the opportunity. So thank you.
Thank you all for joining Gordon Chang and me on this episode of American Thought Leaders. I'm your host, Jan Jekielek.